You're tuned into the Spot Up Pod, the official podcast of the Spot Up Shot newsletter. I'm your host, Paul Garcia. Good Monday morning. Let's jump right into this latest episode of the Spot Up Pod. So our first topic is one called where I'm going to discuss the team options for the Spurs with some upcoming players. So this is something I wrote about last week just because October is approaching and there is a deadline for the Spurs regarding some of their players on rookie scale contracts that they need to make some decisions on. So first, just to kind of go through who these players are. So the Spurs have until October 31st to make a decision whether to exercise a team option for one of these players or decline the team option, which would mean that that player would become a free agent next offseason. So the four players are Victor Wembanyama, who has a $13.4 million team option for next season. Jeremy Sochan, who has a $7.1 million team option for next season. Malaki Branham, who has a $5 million team option for next season. And then Blake Wesley, who also has a $4.7 million team option for next season. Just to clear this out of the way real quick, I think the two players who are safe, definitely safe. I don't have to say think. I think they are safe. Is Victor Wembanyama and Jeremy Sochan. The Spurs will exercise those two players' team options. But the interesting question becomes, what about Wesley and Branham? Are the Spurs going to exercise their team options? And that's the question that we're going to kind of look forward to within this next month of October and figure out, do the Spurs exercise those players' team options or not? So when do the Spurs historically make this decision? I went back and looked at the last 3 years of press releases from the Spurs, and I tried to figure out exactly when they made these announcements. And they usually do it in about mid-October. So as early as October 10th in the last 3 years, but as late as October 23rd. And so Wesley and Branham are the two players to watch, as I'm going to get into in a little bit more detail. It's because, they don't quite, unlike Sochan, who's also going into his third year with the team, Sochan's kind of carved out a role for himself, in the starting lineup or even this coming season, whether he's a starter or off the bench. He's going to be in the 10-man rotation, Jeremy Sochan. Whereas Branham and Wesley, now that the Spurs added a bunch of new players like Chris Paul, Stephon Castle, Harrison Barnes, right? There's like a lot of new players. Those players, their roles aren't guaranteed in terms of, are they going to crack the 10-man rotation? And so that's why it becomes more interesting, the fact that they're going into year 3 and they don't really have a significant role just quite yet or a guaranteed role. And that's why we do want to have this discussion about whether or not the Spurs will exercise the team options for either player. So if the Spurs were to exercise the team options for both Branham and Wesley, well, then that means that they would be on the roster next season under those guaranteed contract amounts that I mentioned earlier. If the Spurs do not exercise the team options by October 31st, well, then next summer, both Branham and Wesley or whichever player didn't get their option extended or exercised, they become unrestricted free agents next season. So again, they go into free agency. And one thing I wanted to note before I get into the final part of this discussion is that the Spurs do have one last evaluation point coming up here, and that's both training camp and then also the preseason, because like I said, they have a few weeks still before having to make this final call on whether or not to exercise the team options for these players. And so again, they can use training camp, see if these two players have made the development that they wanted to see. Maybe one of these players or both of them, stick out compared to other players on the team, and so maybe they definitely got to get the minutes, and so they're going to definitely have them in their future plans. And so they have that little bit of a trial period here from both training camp and the preseason to see, this is like the last mark for both Branham and Wesley to figure out, for the Spurs to figure out if they want to exercise the team options for both or either players. So again, that's something to watch here as well. And so what I want to do here now is kind of just shift over to both, like, if you're the Spurs organization, what are the arguments for keeping both Branham and Wesley, or maybe against, not exercising those team options and letting those players become free agents next summer. So let's first go with the four arguments why the Spurs should exercise their team options. So for one, they're still young players. They're only going into their third NBA season. So maybe if the Spurs feel like they have a lot of upside still, they're not quite at their potential yet or even close to it, then yeah, they can look at exercising the team options. That way they have that player under contract for both this coming season and then also next season as well. That player is under a guaranteed contract as well. So again, that's one of the reasons to keep these players on the roster, is that they're barely going to their third year. And then the other reason is that, let's just say the Spurs don't have any future long-term plans with either of these players. Well, then there's also that ability to not just lose this player for nothing next summer in free agency. You can exercise the team option for the player and then see if maybe you can find a trade, throughout this season up until February. And if not, there's no trade. Well, the next season that player has a guaranteed contract again. So next summer you can look at trades as well to see if maybe you can get like a second-round pick for one of these players or another young player from another team, because maybe other teams have been scouting these players over the last few seasons and seeing maybe they feel like, oh, if we gave Branham a role on our team, or if Wesley, we gave him more of an impact role as a backup point guard, then maybe there's more progress from him there, in our team, as if you're speaking as another GM. And so again, that's another reason to hold on to these two players in terms of exercising their team options, is that you open that door of maybe trying to get future trade assets for one of these two players in that case as well, even if you don't plan on having these players on your team going forward after next season or the season beyond. But then we go to the other side, and why would it be a legitimate reason to not exercise the team option for these players and just decline it and let these players become free agents? And there's a little bit more different sides of this equation as well. For one, there's some veteran players on training camp contracts right now in Malaki, Flynn, and Brandon Boston Jr. that there's no roster spots for. As I've discussed before, let's just say that Flynn and Boston really impress in training camp, and the Spurs need to open up a roster spot. Well, if they decline the team option for either Wesley or Branham, then they could just they could waive those players. There'll still be a cap hit for those players, but instead of having to wait all until free agency next season, they could waive those players now, and then Flynn or Boston can be signed to a standard NBA contracts. So that's one reason, is that if you're not going to exercise the team options for these players because you have you're not going to look for them to be on your roster long term, well, then Flynn and Boston can basically take up those spots. Also, for both players, where are the minutes coming from? For Wesley, he's got Chris Paul in front of him. He's got Trey Jones, most likely. He's got Stephon Castle in front of him. And then for Branham, he's battling with like Julian Champagnie, with Keldon Johnson for like those backup wing minutes. So there's no guarantee, like I said earlier, there's not really a guaranteed role for these players in the 10-man rotation early on, as we look just right now on paper. Financially, one thing that this would do if the Spurs were to decline the team options for these players is that it opens up some cap space next summer. So the Spurs won't have a lot of cap space next summer, but they're going to have a decent amount. And with that, if the Spurs don't have that $5 million salary of Branham and the $4.7 million of Wesley on their books, well, then that opens up a little bit more cap space if they want to go out into free agency and look for other free agents, especially, like I said, if they don't have Branham and Wesley in their long-term plans. So that's another reason to not exercise the team options. And then lastly, this is when I want to give credit to Air Alamo, one of their writers. My piece that I wrote, they read and added some extra details to it in their own write-up of it. And so one of the things that the writers mentioned was that the Spurs are also have some draft picks coming in this coming next season. So there's going to be limited roster space. The Spurs could have anywhere from 2 to 4 first-round picks in next year's draft, the 2025 draft, which is supposed to be a really good draft. Most likely it's going to be 2 picks because the Spurs will have their own pick, plus they get Atlanta's pick. So again, those are the 2 guaranteed picks that are coming to San Antonio next season. And then if, let's just say, the Bulls and the Hornets do better than they're supposed to, and then the Spurs would get their picks as well. But I don't think the Bulls and Hornets are going to get out of the lottery, basically. So they're probably still going to be in the lottery. So the Spurs probably aren't going to get the Charlotte pick or the Chicago pick. But again, at least at minimum, I think 2 players are for sure rookies are coming onto the team next season. Next draft, should I say. And so again, if you move on from Wesley and Branham, because like I said, they haven't fit into the long-term equation of the team, then that opens up those 2 spots for those new rookies. So again, this is a big training camp and a preseason for both Branham and Wesley, and we'll see what they do in terms of how the organization is evaluating them in terms of whether or not they're going to exercise the team options for either or both players. So again, this is something that we'll watch, and I think that an answer would most likely come sometime in mid-October. Okay, so now what I want to do here is just go through some more Twitter questions. So again, about mid-September, I asked for people to follow me on Twitter to send me some questions, and I was just trying to, kind of see where Spurs fans' mindsets are at with the upcoming season coming up, and just kind of seeing what interesting questions they had. And so they sent me some questions, and I tackled 4 of them last week in last week's episode. So again, if you want to listen to round 1 Twitter questions, you can go back and listen to last week's episode. But today we're going to do 4 more questions, and this is round 2. And so let's begin here. So our first question comes from NBA Fantasy Poppy. Their first question is, what's the pecking order for our point guard position, minutes distribution? Okay, so this is something that I wrote about really, mid-July, I would say. I wrote a piece where I was basically writing about, a way too early look at the Spurs' minutes conversation. And in there, I kind of looked at like minutes from last season and kind of the rotations that Pop usually has out on the floor. And so I came up with these very just baseline kind of numbers here for the players. So first of all, to answer your first question, what is the pecking order of the point guard rotation? Not our, but the Spurs' point guard rotation. So I do think, like I said before, I think it's Chris Paul as a starter. Trey Jones is the backup point guard, and then Stephon Castle will be out there in the backup wing, on the backup roster with Trey Jones, and so maybe the Spurs will let him run point guard from time to time and let Trey kind of be there alongside him. So I think that those 4 players are getting 24 minutes each, somewhere around there, like Chris Paul 24 minutes, Trey Jones 24 minutes, and Stephon Castle 24 minutes. So basically, once I did, and I'm going to have this for a visual for those of you that watch this on the video portion. And basically, there was like, when I basically put estimations for all the players that I think will be in the 10-man rotation. And there was about 15 minutes still available there for somebody, for whether it's like a backup wing like Julian Champagnie or Malaki Branham, or even like the Spurs want to play smaller with their second unit and have like 3 guards out there. They could get Blake Wesley some minutes. So I think that there are 15 minutes available somewhere for a player. And if not, maybe that Pop can split those minutes amongst 2 players. Maybe like one player plays 7.5 minutes in the first half, another player plays like 7.5 minutes in the second half. So again, I think there's minutes there for someone, whether it's like Wesley, Champagnie, or Branham, to try to compete for in training camp in the preseason. But again, I think that regarding the point guard roles, I think it's going to be Chris Paul as the starter, Trey Jones as the backup point guard, and then Stephon Castle as the backup shooting guard, who might run some point guard as well. And I do want to note that regarding Paul, because he's a veteran player, he's going to be 39 years old. He is most likely going to miss some games, whether it's due to injury or due to the Spurs just resting him to keep him fresh for the rest of the season. And so if that happens on those nights when Paul's out, there's going to be opportunity for maybe like Trey Jones to become the starting point guard on those games, or maybe Stephon Castle becomes the starting point guard. And so there might be some minutes there for Blake Wesley off at the backup point guard spot in those scenarios. So again, I think that is definitely something to watch, where maybe someone like Wesley has a chance to still get some minutes on those days that maybe like Chris Paul's out for a game, or maybe like a Trey Jones might be out for a game. Those kind of scenarios are there for Wesley to get some minutes. So that's my first answer to that question about what's the pecking order for the Spurs' point guard situation, and also the minutes distribution. For the second question that came up, this is also by @NBA Fantasy Poppy. Their question was also, do we expect Sochan to play full power forward role, or point forward is still a consideration? So just my early thoughts on this question, to answer your question, is I do think that now that the Spurs got 48 minutes of solid point guard play, when they're going to have Chris Paul as a starter, they're going to have Trey Jones as a backup, maybe some Stephon Castle running some point as well off the bench. I think that because they're going to have solid point guard play and better ball handlers on the team this coming season, they don't need to ask Jeremy to be more experimental and creative and trying to learn that role as the point forward like how he did last season, early on in the season, those first 20 games. And so I do think that offensively he's going to be back to more so a traditional power forward role, where he's going to be off the ball in the dunker spot, being ready in terms of if somebody draws some attention on defense, he'll be there setting screens for pick and rolls, those kind of actions, off ball screens. Also, he will get the ball in his hands when they run like dribble handoff action. The Spurs like to do that in their offense, so he's going to get some opportunity to kind of do some DHOs with the guards and wings out there. Regarding shooting the ball, he's going to get his opportunities. When he's left open in the corner, there's still going to be those times when defenses will test him whether or not he's improved his shot. We'll see if that happened, if he improved his shot. And so he's going to get those open looks from both the corner 3 and the arc 3. And then I think the place where he's going to get to be a little bit more creative in that point forward role still, when he pushes the break. So let's say he gets a defensive rebound. I think he's going to be ready to run down court and either find a teammate or try to get through the defense himself and try to get to the bucket. So I think that's going to be his opportunity to still do more so that point forward role like he had last season, is more so in the open court. When it's in the half court though, I do think he'll be in that full power forward role. And then defensively, I just think that they're going to still use him as a versatile defender, where whoever the opposing best scoring or playmaking kind of player is, whether it's a point guard, whether it's a shooting guard, a small forward, or a power forward, I think that they're going to have Sochan, defend that best player on the perimeter offensively for the other team. And of course, they'll have Wemby guarding the 5 or just so that they can have Victor near the paint at all times. So I think that Sochan's still that very versatile defender, where they want to put him on the best matchups offensively and try to get him to limit those players as best as possible. And then he's also switchable defensively on those kind of assignments. Let's just say like the Spurs put Sochan like a Steph Curry, right, against the Warriors. Then I think Harrison Barnes kind of shifts down to the power forward role. Maybe he guards a player like Draymond Green. So those kind of scenarios, I still think defensively, Sochan doesn't have to quite just play the power forward role. He can actually roam around and guard different positions, whoever Pop needs him to guard, out on the perimeter or in the front court, aside from the big men like the 5s that Victor will be responsible for guarding. So now our third question comes from @Branham Muse. So their first question, they actually had 2 questions in here, but I did save one of them for the newsletter. So the first question was estimate Jeremy Sochan's contract extension. So this is a question that I really liked, and so I wanted to save that one for the newsletter and more writing. So I actually wrote that one recently in a piece called Team Options and answering a Twitter question about Jeremy Sochan. And so again, I'm not going to go into a lot of details because I did save this question for subscribers that are subscribed to the newsletter. And so if you subscribe on Substack on the Spot Up Shot, you'll get access to that full answer. But I'll just kind of do a quick summary of the answer without going into too much detail. Basically, Sochan can't be extended until next summer. So again, he's got to play this third season first with the Spurs, and then next offseason, the Spurs can look at extending him like they did with Keldon Johnson, like they did recently with Devin Vassell. And my basic takeaway here was that because he hasn't played year 3 of his career yet, we got to see what kind of development he makes offensively. We know that going into year 3, he's already a better defender than Keldon and Vassell were in their first 2 years in their career. But he's already above them in that area. But offensively, they were a little bit further along already going into year 3, both with their outside shooting, with their 3-point shot, and also their scoring ability, out of the perimeter. So I think that's where this season's going to be huge for critical for Jeremy in terms of how much money the Spurs look at if they do want to extend him, how much that looks like based on how much development does he make offensively. If he makes a big jump, then maybe he can start looking at some of the numbers, contract extension numbers similar to like Keldon Johnson at the low end or high end of Devin Vassell. Or if he doesn't make a huge jump offensively, still more of a question mark on that end. Well, then I think that he could still get an extension just based on his defense, the kind of versatility he provides to the team. But it might be just something, an amount slightly above the mid-level exception going forward. That's kind of where the Spurs would maybe look at for him. So again, that's kind of my very small answer, or a very condensed answer to my question. So like I said, if you go to the spotupshot.com and you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll get that full answer where I lay out the numbers, the stats, and my actual estimation of a contract for Sochan. But now let's get to the question I do want to answer here on the podcast. And this is your second question. It is, what will Malaki, Branham, and Blake Wesley's roles be after adding Chris Paul and Stephon Castle to the roster? So like I've kind of said before in other episodes, is that, adding Chris Paul and Stephon Castle does make it, it makes it, they're no longer, they don't have guaranteed roles, I think, in my opinion, Branham and Wesley. I think they have to compete for those roles, their old roles in training camp and the preseason. So early on, I do think that Julian Champagnie is ahead of those players in the rotation, just because Champagnie provides the known outside shooting, where Branham, that's still a part of his game that he's developing. Same thing for Wesley. So he's going to be able to space the floor. He's shown the coaching staff that he can do that through his first few years of the Spurs. And then defensively, he also, he's a stable defender out there. He's not going to be, a huge weakness out there on defense. And so I think that right now Champagnie has that role as the backup power forward, you would say. And so I think that's kind of where Branham, he's kind of competing with Julian for minutes. And if not, maybe Pop splits the minutes for him. And then same thing for Wesley, he, like I said earlier in the point guard discussion, he's further behind, Chris Paul, behind Trey Jones, behind Stephon Castle. And so he's going to have to wait for his opportunities when maybe one of the veteran players is out, like Paul or Jones, from a game. Then he gets his opportunities as a backup point guard. Or maybe he can really outshine some of those players like Champagnie and Branham, and then Pop has to look at maybe running like a 3-guard lineup situation off the bench, because he needs Wesley out there. So it really depends on, for these two players, how does their training camp and their preseason go? If they really shine in those two areas, then maybe the coaching staff looks at finding a role for them. But again, right now on paper, because we haven't seen any basketball being played yet, I do think Champagnie's ahead of those two players in the rotation. And so I do think that they're more so there, and they're kind of waiting to get into games until nights when either a player's out due to injury, or maybe it's like a blowout in a game, whether the Spurs are winning or losing. That's kind of the only time I see them getting into games right now. Okay, so now for our final question. This one comes from @LDP93345, or username Yee. That was a little bit easier to say. So their question is, what's the team's plan for Sidy Cissoko? Does he have a chance to make the rotation in the new season? So again, early on, based on what I've seen in Summer League, and then also what the roster looks like on paper before training camp starts next week, I do think that Cissoko is out of the rotation early on. So here's how I have the backup. Just again, my opinion on the backup. Basically, power forward wing minutes. Basically, at backup point guard is Trey Jones. At backup 2, it's Stephon Castle. Backup 3, it's Julian Champagnie. Backup 4, Keldon Johnson. And then backup 5 is Zach Collins. So again, if the Spurs want to go with the small ball 4 off the bench and Keldon Johnson, then I think it's tough for CD to get any kind of minutes, because again, he's not gonna beat. I don't think he would beat Keldon Johnson for those kind of minutes, because Keldon's one of the players who's one of the go-to players on this team, especially off the bench here, if he comes off the bench this coming season. The only way that I see there's an opening for CD is if the Spurs want to slot Keldon down to the 3, where they deliberately want to make him like a small forward off the bench. Then that might open up some opportunity for CD to compete with Sandro Mamukelashvili for the power forward role. We know that Mamu's going to give you a little bit more size at the 4. CD's going to give you a little bit more versatility defensively, but he's more so like a 3 basically out there size wise. So again, I think that's where that conversation could happen. Of possibly getting CD a role is if Keldon were to deliberately play the backup 3, and then that means like Champagnie's out of the rotation, Malaki Branham's out of the rotation, Blake Wesley's out of the rotation, then I think there's an opportunity there for CD. Also, I think Sidy, because he can play a little bit like the small forward kind of role, he could also get into the competition with Champagny and Branham to try to get some of those backup wing minutes. So again, that's also an area for him to try to shine summer in training camp and the preseason, to see if he can maybe beat out one of those players to try to get some minutes as well. So again, right now on paper, I don't think he's going to be part of the rotation. But again, that's the purpose of training camp and preseason. It's to see what have these players done in the offseason to improve their game, and then where do they best fit on the team, and can they outshine in their roles. So again, that's kind of what we'll look for with Sidy Cissoko. So that kind of wraps up this episode of the Spot Up Pod. Just letting you know that the Spurs are getting started next week. Training camp for a lot of the NBA teams starts officially on September 30th. It's media day. And then from there, it's basically training camp for about a week. And then the next week after that, 2 weeks from now, we have games. We have preseason games going for a few weeks. And then the regular season is here in mid-October. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode of the Spot Up Pod. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a rating on your favorite podcast apps and our YouTube channel. The Spot Up Pod is recorded and produced by Paul Garcia. The music for this episode was written by Vincent Garcia and Paul Garcia. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.